The Canadian prairies were changing. The year was 1885. The buffalo, once plentiful, were disappearing. The Métis people, who relied on the buffalo, were worried. They faced a future of poverty and displacement. The Canadian government, eager to settle the West, seemed indifferent to their plight. This sparked a rebellion, a clash of cultures and ambitions that would forever shape Canada's history. The Northwest Rebellion, as it is known, was a pivotal moment. It was a desperate struggle for survival by the Métis, led by the charismatic and controversial reil. The rebellion was ultimately crushed, but not before exposing the raw nerves of cultural misunderstanding and the high cost of westward expansion. This conflict, though largely forgotten in the annals of time, holds important lessons for us today. It reminds us of the importance of understanding and respecting different cultures. It also reminds us of the need to listen to the voices of those who are marginalized and forgotten. The echoes of the Northwest Rebellion can still be felt today, reminding us that the pursuit of progress must never come at the expense of justice and compassion. To understand the Northwest Rebellion, one must first understand the Métis people. Born from the unions of European fur traders and First Nations women, predominantly Cree and Ojibwe, the Métis emerged as a distinct culture in the Canadian West. They were skilled hunters, traders, and interpreters, fluent in both Indigenous languages and French. They developed a unique way of life, deeply connected to the land and the buffalo hunt. The Métis were a proud and independent people. They had their own language, Michif, a blend of French and Cree. They had their own system of governance, based on kinship and elected leaders. They were a vibrant and resourceful community, accustomed to the vastness of the prairies and the challenges of frontier life. But the westward expansion of Canada threatened their way of life. The arrival of railroads and settlers disrupted the buffalo hunt and brought with it new diseases that ravaged their communities. The Métis saw their traditional lands being surveyed and sold to newcomers, their voices ignored by a distant government. A sense of unease of being pushed aside in their own homeland began to fester. As the Canadian government continued its westward push, the Métis found their traditional way of life under increasing threat. Their pleas for land rights and recognition were largely ignored by the Canadian government. They watched as their traditional hunting grounds were carved up for homesteads and railroads, their pleas for recognition falling on deaf ears. Fear and resentment grew within the Métis communities, the seeds of rebellion slowly taking root. Adding to their grievances was the issue of land titles. The Métis, accustomed to a more fluid system of land ownership, found themselves at odds with the government's insistence on individual land grants. Many Métis were unable to secure title to the land they had occupied for generations, fueling their anxieties and further alienating them from the Canadian government. The government seemed deaf to their concerns, their actions perceived as a betrayal of the Métis people. The Métis felt betrayed and abandoned by the government that was supposed to represent them. They had fought alongside the Canadian government in the past, helping to quell the Red River Rebellion in 1869. Yet, their loyalty seemed to count for little as they saw their way of life slipping away. The stage was set for a confrontation, a desperate attempt to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. In 1884, with tensions reaching a boiling point, the Métis turned to a familiar figure for leadership, reil. Exiled to the United States after the Red River Rebellion, reil was a controversial figure. He was a gifted orator, a skilled negotiator, and a devout Catholic who believed he was divinely chosen to lead his people. Reil's return to Canada electrified the Métis community. His presence galvanized the Métis, giving voice to their grievances and uniting them under a common cause. He listened to their concerns, articulated their demands, and promised to lead them in their fight for their rights. Reil's charisma and fiery rhetoric rekindled the spirit of resistance among the Metis. Reil, however, was a divisive figure. While revered by many Metis, he was viewed with suspicion by the Canadian government and much of the Anglo-Canadian population. His involvement injected a sense of urgency and volatility into the situation. His presence transformed a simmering discontent into a full-blown rebellion. Section 5. The Provisional Government, a Nation in the Making. In March 1885, with negotiations with the Canadian government at a standstill, Reil and his followers formed a provisional government in Batoche, Saskatchewan. The Metis drafted a list of rights, demanding recognition of their land claims, guarantees for their language and religion, and representation in the Canadian government. They were determined to negotiate with the Canadian government from a position of strength. The establishment of the provisional government was a bold move. It signaled the Metis' intention to govern themselves and protect their interests, even if it meant resorting to arms. They established a military force, gathering arms and ammunition, preparing to defend their newly declared nation. The Metis were prepared to fight for their rights, for their land, for their very survival. The die was cast. The formation of the provisional government was a direct challenge to Canadian authority. What began as a plea for recognition had transformed into a full-blown rebellion, setting the stage for a bloody confrontation between the Metis and the Canadian government. Section 6. The Northwest Resistance. Battles for Survival. The Northwest Rebellion was a series of skirmishes and battles fought across the vast expanse of the Canadian prairies. The Metis, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought with fierce determination. They were defending their homeland, their families, their very way of life. Their knowledge of the land and their horsemanship gave them a tactical advantage in the early stages of the rebellion. One of the most tragic events of the rebellion was the Frog Lake Massacre. In April 1885, a group of Cree warriors, allies of the Metis, attacked the small settlement of Frog Lake. Fueled by their own grievances against the Canadian government and inspired by the Metis resistance, the Cree killed 9 settlers and took others hostage. The Frog Lake Massacre sent shockwaves through the country, hardening attitudes on both sides and escalating the conflict. The rebellion reached its climax at the Battle of Batoche, a small Metis settlement that served as the headquarters of the provisional government. For 3 days in May 1885, the Metis fiercely resisted the advancing Canadian forces. Armed with outdated rifles and a limited supply of ammunition, they fought bravely against a larger and better equipped enemy. Section 7. Defeat and Despair. The Fall of Batoche. The Battle of Batoche proved to be a turning point in the rebellion. The Metis fought courageously, using their knowledge of the land to their advantage, but they were ultimately overwhelmed by the superior firepower and numbers of the Canadian troops. The fall of Batoche marked the beginning of the end for the Metis resistance. With their defenses crumbling, the Metis were forced to abandon Batoche. Reil, realizing the futility of further resistance, surrendered to Canadian authorities a few days later. His capture effectively ended the rebellion, extinguishing the last embers of Metis hope. The defeat at Batoche had devastating consequences for the Metis. Their homes and communities lay in ruins. Many were left homeless and destitute, their way of life shattered. The dream of a self-governing Metis nation lay in tatters, replaced by the harsh reality of defeat and despair. Section 8. The Legacy of Reil Martyr or Rebel. Following his capture, Reil was put on trial for treason. Despite impassioned pleas for clemency and arguments of insanity, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. His execution, which took place on November 16, 1885, sparked outrage and protests across Quebec, further deepening the divide between French and English Canada. Reil's execution turned him into a martyr for the Metis and a symbol of French-Canadian resistance against English-Canadian dominance. He became a powerful symbol of cultural and linguistic oppression, his name forever etched in the annals of Canadian history. His legacy continues to be debated today, with some viewing him as a heroic defender of his people, and others as a misguided rebel. The Northwest Rebellion and the fate of Louis Riel remain a sensitive and complex chapter in Canadian history. It is a story of cultural clash, of political maneuvering, of the human cost of westward expansion. It is a story that continues to resonate today, reminding us of the importance of reconciliation, understanding, and the pursuit of justice for all Canadians. Section 9. Lasting Impacts: Shaping a Nation's Conscience. The Northwest Rebellion had far-reaching consequences for Canada. It highlighted the cultural and political divisions within the young nation. It exposed the government's shortcomings in its treatment of Indigenous peoples. The rebellion also led to changes in Canadian policy, including the creation of the Northwest Territories Act in 1875 and the Indian Act in 1876. The rebellion also had a profound impact on the Métis people. They were labeled as rebels, their contributions to Canada largely ignored. They faced discrimination and prejudice, their culture and identity marginalized. It took decades for the Métis to recover from the trauma of the rebellion and to begin to assert their rights and reclaim their place in Canadian society. The Northwest Rebellion serves as a stark reminder of the importance of understanding and respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. It underscores the need for dialogue, for reconciliation, and for building a more just and equitable society for all Canadians. The echoes of the rebellion can still be heard today, urging us to learn from the mistakes of the past and strive for a future where all cultures are valued and respected.